There's a distinctly Bavarian flavour to this G7 summit. So when US President Barack Obama arrived in this German alpine retreat, a mid-morning pint of local beer was priority number one. Or was it more about showing unity in front of the cameras? There was even time for a couple of jokes.
I have to admit that I forgot to bring my lederhosen, but I'm going to see if I can buy some while I'm here.
Before setting a more serious tone.
We're going to discuss our shared future, a global economy that creates jobs and opportunity, maintaining a strong and prosperous European Union, forging new trade partnerships across the Atlantic, standing up to Russian aggression in Ukraine.
The conflict has been dominating discussions. There are signs America's European partners may toughen their stance on Russia.
My intention is that today we reconfirm the G7 unity on the sanctions policy. So let me state clearly, given the current situation, if anyone wants to start a debate about changing the sanctions regime, the discussion could only be about strengthening it.
Russia flatly rejects claims it is preventing peace in the region, instead blaming Kiev for failing to properly implement the Minsk peace agreement.
I want to underline that Russia is interested in and will strive to ensure the full and unconditional implementation of all Minsk agreements, and I believe there is no other way to solving the crisis today.
There are, of course, a whole range of other issues up for discussion, but the public emphasis has been on Ukraine above all else, and a determination to show a common approach. Russia's isolation may have consequences, but for now, it looks certain to continue.
For more on this issue, we're now joined by Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. In Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO and CEO of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And in Moscow, we're also joined by Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst from Russia. Gentlemen, welcome to World Insight. My first question starts with you, Mr. Volker. Russia's membership of the G8 has been suspended for a second year now. Is it a smart move to keep Russia on the outside? Would it be more productive if we bring in Russia to the debating table to solve the crisis?
No, I don't think it would be productive at all. The G7 is a group of like-minded democracies. They're industrialized countries. They've got substantial economies in most cases. And they are very like-minded and able to reach agreements together and able to try to shape and coordinate their own policies. Russia is very different from that. It is no longer a democracy. We can't call it that, given the way that you have the authoritarian regime at home. It has acted against its neighbors. It has annexed part of Ukraine. It's invaded part of Ukraine. It's invaded Georgia and occupies part of that territory. And so I think having Russia there would be more disruptive than it would be constructive.
Mr. Felgenhauer, I would like to ask your response on it. How do you feel about this exclusion? How do you view Russia's position in the G8, the former G8 group? Because our Washington guest said there, Russia is pretty much very different, the opposite of the other 7 countries.
Well, for the former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and for Russian President Boris Yeltsin, it was very important in the late 80s and then in the 90s to become an associate member and then a full member of the G7 that expanded to G8, sort of to be member of the club. The present Russian position is that it is not as important. That's what is really important is the G20 group, which it includes all major world economic powers, including India and China and Brazil, and not only Western countries. And so if the G7 don't want Russia, Russia does not really want the G7 too, and so it's okay. We'll not be knocking on the G7 door anymore. They excluded us. They closed this G8 club. Okay, it's okay with us. If they want to restore it, it's their initiative, not ours.
Well, the Ukraine crisis has been on top of the agenda at the G7 summit this year, but without Russia being at the G7, can they reach any kind of solutions to that crisis there?
Exactly, I don't think so, because as we know, Russia played a very important role in this crisis, just like recognized by some Western countries. So now I think that kicking out Russia from G8, I think it would be a very big failure for G8, because once there is a G8, I think that it could play the role of a platform to get some more negotiation or discussion between Russia and other Western countries. But now, they are far away. I mean, between Russia and the Western countries, distant. So how could get some more communication and mutual understanding and mutual trust? Lost everything. Yeah.
And now the Western countries are pretty critical. They're pretty serious about the sanctions that are still imposed on Russia. And the EU sanctions will be expired by the end of July. So my next question goes to you, Mr. Volker. Should the sanctions be lifted, continued, suspended, or even further ramped up even more?
Well, at a minimum, they should be maintained, and I would in fact think that they should be increased. To respond to the previous speaker, there isn't a lack of venue for dialogue with Russia about Ukraine. We've had talks bilaterally among many countries. We've had the Minsk group, the Minsk process itself, with Germany and France speaking with Russia. There have been negotiations directly with Ukraine. The problem here is not a lack of dialogue or a lack of venue. The problem is that you have fundamentally different views between Russia and Ukraine and the others about what should happen in Ukraine. Russia is supporting military forces in eastern Ukraine. It has occupied part of the territory. It has annexed Crimea, and it has tried to enforce a standoff with the Ukrainian government. Ukraine is now, by the Minsk agreement, prevented even from accessing all of its own territory. Imagine if that were the case of China unable to access Chinese territory. So it is quite a fundamentally different point of view. I think the only way to make progress on Ukraine is for Russia to feel that the costs of this kind of intervention are too high. Right now, that is not the case, so Russia is going to continue down this track. And I think raising the costs, including through more sanctions, would be an appropriate step at this time.
Mr. Falkenhauer, do you agree to this?
Well, I would believe that right now the main problem is not so much progress, it's avoiding a deterioration. Right now the situation is very tense on the ground in Ukraine. Where it's already summer. The political dialogue is more or less right now deadlocked, and there's a high possibility that there's going to be some kind of escalation, maybe of fighting, and that would of course result in much more serious tension between Russia and the West and Russia and Ukraine. So I believe that Western leaders right now are mostly preoccupied with preventing further deterioration, and actually preventing maybe even a standoff directly between Russia and NATO, and not of course in Ukraine, but in their major exercises of both sides happening on land and sea in Europe right now, and more planned in the coming months. And this could actually lead to some possible accidents and even direct tension. So the problem is to kind of keep the lid on the pot right now.
There are conflicting views about the roots of the crisis. Mr. Cui, some say it's the eastwards expansion of NATO, and others say it's the westwards invasion of Russia. What's your view on this?
I think it depends on which kind of stand you will take. Exactly, I think from a Russian perspective, especially obviously, it's a kind of enlargement of NATO, or kind of aggravation of Western countries to some, especially the former Soviet Union countries, give the cause of the crisis. Of course, from a Western countries' perspective, it's a kind of a very tough Russian policy, especially President Putin take a policy out of the date. So now there is a crisis. But I do believe that certainly because of the lack of mutual trust between Russia and the Western countries, it's a very, very big reason for this crisis. And also, of course, I think Ukraine itself, especially how could it build up a country, a nation state, It's a very, very big, reason why this time this crisis took place in Ukraine.
Yeah, not only mistrust, but also finger-pointing and accusations.
Yes.
Mr. Volker, what is the foreign country's role in the crisis in Ukraine? Because we're seeing a lot of naming names. For instance, the Western countries are accusing Russia's involvement in it, and Russia is accusing NATO's presence in Eastern Europe. How do you view this?
Well, the first thing is, let's start by talking about the people who live in Central and Eastern Europe. These are Ukrainians or Poles or Lithuanians or Estonians. And these are countries that were either occupied and incorporated into the Soviet Union in the case of the Baltic states, or occupied with Soviet troops and part of the Warsaw Pact for decades. When they had the opportunity to have their independence restored and to become democracies, they wanted to make sure that they were able to defend themselves and that that wouldn't happen again. So they all wanted to join NATO. NATO was very slow to accept them, pointing out that they needed to have stable democracies and market economies. But eventually they did join NATO in the case of Central Europe or the Baltic states. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, has not been invited to join NATO, same with Georgia. The proximate cause of the conflict in Ukraine now was its effort to join the European Union. And that was moving towards an association agreement. The Yanukovych government rejected that, and people protested, and then he fled the country. So it is not really about NATO creeping up to Russia's borders that is the driver here. It's about people choosing their own destiny in Central and Eastern Europe, and Russia apparently not feeling very comfortable with that.
Mr. Falkenhauer, speaking of Russia's insecurity in this, some say Ukraine is Russia's bottom line in Eastern Europe. Do you agree?
Well, the kind of quote-unquote loss of Ukraine, yes, it's not seen as really acceptable. Ukrainians are seen by many Russians, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said so publicly that Russians and Ukrainians are basically one nation, one people, one один народ. And so them becoming a kind of pro-Western bastion in the middle of the Russian plain is not really seen as militarily, politically, or even in a civilization form acceptable to Moscow much at all. And this is a much behind the present crisis, which is, I'm afraid, is going to develop and may go from bad to worse if very serious effort is not put into some kind of good crisis management. That should be the first priority, to solve the problem in general, to find a principled solution that will last for decades and generations. That may be postponed for a time. Right now we have to deal with the immediate threat of the immediate escalation, further escalation of this crisis.
Speaking of escalation of crisis, just recently Russia's military aircraft were scrambled to face off to the U.S. warships in the Black Sea. Russia has assured NATO that it is not a threat to the group. Does NATO take that word seriously, Mr. Volker?
Well, I think if you're asking, do we expect that Russia will try to attack NATO? No, I don't think we expect that. So in that respect, I think we would agree. That is in part due to Russian intentions. It's also in part due to the capabilities of NATO to defend itself. It has very capable military forces. And so I think we view that aspect of this, the NATO-Russia relationship, as essentially stable. Where we see conflict and where it's unstable is these countries in between that are seeking to develop their own identity, and that's an area where Russia has intervened and where NATO has not responded very much, and we see this continuing conflict. If I could add a point on this too, I think Pavel made a very good point, which was that in the eyes of many Russians, including President Putin, he sees Ukrainians and Russians as essentially the same people. However, in the eyes of Ukrainians, they do not see themselves as Russian, and they do not see themselves as wanting to be ruled by the Kremlin. And I think it's really that difference, a distinct Ukrainian identity that is not recognized in Russia, that is really part of the root of this crisis.
Mr. Falkenhauer, I saw the eyebrow raising during our DC guest comments. What were you concerning? Mr. Falkenhauer? I guess we might have lost our Moscow guest there. So I would like to turn up to our studio guest here. So where does the antagonism come from?
I think now the problem is we need to understand how is the change of the the international situation and how it is and then more and more competition between big powers, especially between Russia and the United States. And now I think it's just a temporary period. And finally, both Russia and the United States, they should do something together, not only in the framework of G7 and also in some other. Just like this time, I think even for European leaders and the United States itself, they recognize that they need also some cooperation from Russia in some other issues, not only in Ukraine.
Let's go back to the topic of G7 right now. Is it possible that Russia would return to G8?
So far, I don't think some possibility, because it depends on how is this, the mindset of Western countries in the G7. Because so far, I heard so many times repeated by Ambassador Walker, how about the venue? So I think now it looks like a very, very big barrier for Western countries to recognize that, okay, it's time for Russia to go back to G8, because now they still stress that the value is so important, especially the common value. So now I think that if they insist this kind of logo, I think it's very difficult for both two sides to get more mutual trust.
I believe we have Mr. Falkenhauer back on the line. Mr. Falkenhauer, we have been discussing about the possibility of Moscow returning back to G8. The Western countries have no intention of bringing Russia back to the table, and Russia care less about that?
Well, right now, Moscow is going to be concentrating on improving its ties, institutional ties with the BRICS group of nations, with the Shanghai Security Organization, with, of course, the G20, and putting aside G8 as not very relevant. So if they don't want us, well, we don't want them too. So right now,
so
it's
Moscow
going to
has
be rather on hold
no
for the
interest
foreseeable
of
future.
joining G8 right now. My last question, very quickly, to you, Mr. Volker. Wouldn't that be placing G7 into even more of a rich man's club?
Well, if you remember, the origins of the G7 were that it was to be the world's largest industrialized democracies as a way of coordinating. If they take policies and steps in the world that are at odds with each other, it can cause quite a bit of turbulence in the international system. If instead they're able to coordinate, they can help shape the international system a bit. So I think it does serve a purpose. As again, Mr. Falkenhauer said, it's not the only organization. You have the G7, you have the United Nations, you have the G20, you have lots of venues. This one happens to be the one where the world's largest industrialized democracies get together, they're like-minded, and try to coordinate some of their policies.
They were originally grouped together for economic purposes, but now is trying to expand its political influence in that region. Thank you very much for all of your analysis. That was Mr. Cui Hongjian, Mr. Kirk Volker in Washington, D.C., and Moscow, Mr. Pavel Falkenhauer. And that is all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insights CCTV News into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. I'm Wang Yinjun in Beijing. From myself and all the World Insight team, thanks for your company, and join us again tomorrow for more global perspectives and stories from across China and around the world. Goodbye for now.